Welcome back, guys, and welcome to our last mini-vid on Key Idea 7.3, Growing Tensions Over Political Power and Economic Issues Spark a Movement for Independence from Great Britain. What we are talking about today is Concept 7.4D, which is that the outcome of the American Revolution was influenced by strategy, geographic conditions, influence from Native Americans, and other nations, and that the Treaty of Paris was ultimately established to signify peace and to give freedom to the American colonies. Now, the first slide that we're going to take a look up here is as this Revolutionary War starts and as the fighting continues, what we're looking at here is certain strategies, strengths, and weaknesses that each side had that should have made the British successful, but ultimately which gave the Americans victory. And so some of the first things that you should write down in your notes that Americans had to their advantage was better leadership, for starters. George Washington is often considered one of the best leaders in the history of the United States. He was able to take this ragtag group of colonists, non-soldiers, just average Minutemen, average citizens that were participating in the militia, and turning them into soldiers and giving them a way to win up against all costs. The other thing that the Americans did that was better than the British is they also implemented better strategy and tactics. And so just like we had talked about in class, where the British were oftentimes faced with fighting with what we call gentlemen's warfare, where they would march their soldiers out onto the field of battle and basically take turns shooting at each other back and forth across the field. The Americans decided to employ a strategy called guerrilla tactics, and those guerrilla tactics allowed the Americans to fight and hide, use camouflage, and not be sitting targets for the British to just shoot at. If they would have fought that way, they would have probably never won the Revolutionary War. They just had not enough soldiers and not enough ammunition. And so with having good leadership and having good strategy, it also was very helpful to the Americans that they were fighting on their own land. Many of these citizen fighters, militiamen, knew the land that they were fighting on, so they knew where the good spots were to fight, where the bad spots were to fight, and how to stay out of them. So knowing the land is a huge advantage for the Americans in getting ready for the war. Another thing that was an advantage for the Americans is that they were fighting for their freedom. Unlike the British soldiers that were over here mostly fighting for a paycheck, fighting because they were told they had to, because that's what the king wanted, the Americans were fighting for something a little bit more valuable to them. They were fighting for something that they were motivated by internally. They had that will, that spirit, that never give up attitude that the British soldiers just didn't have because they were not fighting for anything personal. They were fighting because it was kind of a job for them. So the strategy that the Americans implied was to fight a defensive war and to not attack necessarily the British all the time and go seek out conflict, but just fight a defensive war where they forced the British to come to them, where they didn't have to use their resources unless absolutely necessary, basically trying to fight the war as long as they possibly could so that hopefully the British would give up and just not want to fight anymore. And so this type of strategy worked really well combined with the use of guerrilla tactics. Like we'd mentioned earlier, guerrilla tactics are just the use of hit and run maneuvers where you're not standing there in an open field trying to trade shots with the British. These were the American strengths, weaknesses, and strategies. Now on the other side, the British had more troops, they had more resources, they had a stronger navy, and so they felt like they were just going to come in and dominate the Americans and that the war was not going to take that long. It was going to be over very quickly. What ends up happening is they fight this offensive war, meaning they were going after the colonists and trying to take the fight to the colonists. But when that happens and you're not successful, sometimes you get a little bit frustrated. And if you're using old tactics like the British were, they were using what was called gentlemen's warfare, where they marched out onto the field. They often claimed that the colonists weren't fighting fairly, and they were getting frustrated, and did get frustrated by that. And so when you look at these two groups and compare them, and you look at the size of the armies, and you look at the level of resources each side had, it is obvious that the British probably should have won the Revolutionary War. But all those intangible things that the Americans had fighting for them freedom, knowing the land, better leadership, is ultimately going to allow them to win. And so when we take a look at this, what we're looking at here is the flow of the war. And so there are several battles that take place, and I would love it if you would get these down in your notes. The first major battle after Bunker Hill was the Battle of Long Island. And so during this battle, the Americans lose, and they're in retreat off of Long Island back into Pennsylvania. They're not very successful, the Americans are, at the beginning of the war. They lose a lot of battles. And so what ends up happening after the Battle of Long Island, Washington decides to sneak up on the British and cross over the Delaware River, which is the river right between Pennsylvania and New Jersey, and he leads an attack on the British during Christmas time when they thought that maybe fighting had stopped and they were really not prepared and on the defensive, and Washington was able to sneak a victory out. The picture below down here is a picture that is oftentimes familiar in social studies class. It is a picture of Washington leading his troops across the Delaware River. A very major point in the Revolutionary War for the Americans because it gave them confidence. It gave them something that they could lean on, some success that they could build from. And so victory was not done. At Trenton, which is the next place they fight, the Americans again win and beat the British, and this hope that they get ultimately drives and propels them forward. And so with a couple of victories in hand, they go off and they fight at the Battle of Saratoga, which is our next battle here. Saratoga is often called the turning point, or the tipping point. Up until this point, the British have been winning the majority of the battles, but as America wins a couple here and there, they're small victories. And then finally, at the last second, they win this major battle at Saratoga. And the reason that's so important is Saratoga, which is up near Lake Champlain, kind of cuts the British off from the St. Lawrence River and all of their resources up in Canada. And so this American victory now is huge because now, after this victory, they start getting help from foreign countries. Some Native American groups start to join their fighting, and they're just rejuvenated as an army. After the fighting at Saratoga, they finish up at Valley Forge. Valley Forge is where they rested for the winter. They were able to somehow get through a winter with very little food, very little supplies, and through this, they fought off disease that almost ended their chances in the war. They almost were done because they didn't have enough soldiers and enough food and enough resources. But George Washington and the rest of his command were able to get the troops through and able to join in with the French, who sends troops and a navy to help the American war effort out. With new energy, we move on to fighting in the south and at sea. They're going to get some new training from the French troops, as we had said earlier, and this new training and these guerrilla tactics are going to allow the Americans to start to pick up some victories, which ultimately leads to the last and final battle, which we call Yorktown, the Battle of Yorktown. And so this long, endless battle finally ends in the south on Yorktown Harbor, where the British ultimately surrender to the playing of the song "The World Turned Upside Down," which is fitting probably because this is the first time that a set of colonies had ever defeated their home country. And so the flow of war, real quickly with all the battles, the key battle you need to know is Saratoga. Saratoga was the turning point because before the Battle of Saratoga happened, France was giving some money and some supplies, but ultimately stayed neutral, which means they didn't get involved in the fighting officially. They were going to stay out of the war. They didn't want to pick a fight with the British until they were absolutely sure that the Americans would win that war effort. In which case, after the Battle of Saratoga, The victory proves that the Americans actually had a chance of winning, that they would win, and France becomes an official ally. They sign an agreement with the Americans that says that France is going to provide military and naval help, and France ultimately declares war on Great Britain. This is going to be absolutely helpful to the Americans, as now not only do the British have to deal with the colonists and all of the resources going to fighting off the colonists, but now they also have to worry about fighting France, which was a much bigger proposition. And so, like we said earlier, in the flow of the battles, a lot of different battles happen. And then the final battle is here at Yorktown, where you have another rendition over here to the right of the British surrendering to Washington. What ultimately happens is General Cornwallis for the British, as you can see on the map to the right, kind of retreats to the Yorktown Peninsula, and he has all his troops here trapped along the banks of the York River. And then the Americans move in and surround him with the help of the French, and they kind of trap him in, forcing him to surrender. They lay siege to his camp, and he has nowhere to go. And so, with that, the British finally give up. They recognize that this has been a long process and that trying to fight the Americans is probably not going to be successful. And so, the questions become, after the Americans win their freedom, is how did that happen? What allowed the Americans to win? What does that mean for America now? Would they be able to hang onto their freedom? Meaning, as we move forward, is somebody going to try to come back in and take them over because they're such a young nation? And what do we do first? Now that the British are gone and we got rid of the king, what do we have to do now as a set of 13 independent states? And so, real quickly, some reasons for victory for the Americans is that the Americans knew the land and they knew how to use it to their advantage, where in contrast, the British were far away from their homes and didn't always know how to maximize their resources. Reason number two for victory is this patriotic spirit. Americans were fighting for their identity, for their independence, for their families, where the British were fighting far away from home in a land they had no idea what they were doing or where they were, and ultimately just doing for a check. Third reason for victory is skilled leadership. Washington had great knowledge, skill, and courage, and stayed dedicated to the cause. He always was about fighting to win for American independence, where Britain's leaders were experienced, but they're trying to fight this gentleman's war, where they're still trying to use old tactics, and they were more concerned about their personal glory instead of the glory for the Americans, or excuse me, for the country of England. And then lastly, the reason for Americans' victory was help from others. The United States was able to find success through having support from France and its navy, which they got after the Battle of Saratoga, where Britain should have been able to win on its own, but didn't really use its allies enough. And so again, make sure in your notes you get down these 4 reasons for victory, and what ultimately does this mean for the 13 colonies. Despite the king's desire to keep fighting the war, English Parliament, their government, decides to end it. They realize that this is costing them way too much money. It's not worth it to try and continue to control the 13 colonies. And so they sat down with American leaders and they signed the Treaty of Paris, 1783. And in this treaty, they recognize, number one, that America is now independent. Number two, they set America's borders from the Atlantic Ocean, right over here, to the Mississippi River, and from Canada up here all the way down to the northern border of Florida. And so for the time being, in 1783, that is what the United States will look like. Now, according to the treaty, the Americans were also supposed to restore land and possession to the Loyalists, but ultimately they are going to ignore that. Our final screen of the day are what are the ultimate impacts of the war. Please make sure you get these down. Number one is the creation of the United States of America. Number two, revolutions around the world will be inspired. And number three, the U.S. is now a proud nation, but now has to pay off its debt and support its people and figure out what kind of government it will have. So hopefully you enjoyed. We'll talk to you soon. Make sure you get these notes.